For anyone that doesn't know, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin are the sort of tier one, the primary markets in Europe. All of those, for different reasons, are constrained at the moment. And thus there's been the emergence of a whole sort of secondary market set of locations, for example, Berlin, Madrid, Manchester in the UK, albeit the UK is obviously not part of the European Union anymore.
Hello and welcome to Cool Vector. I'm David Snow, your host. And today we're joined by Zahl Limbuwala. He's an operating partner at DTCP. DTCP is based in Germany, and it is an investor in digital infrastructure across the European middle market. Zahl was the former chief operating officer of Atlas Edge, and he has now joined DTCP to help expand and improve their data center investment program. So Zahl, welcome to Cool Vector. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, David. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd love to learn about the European market for data centers. There's a lot going on, and you are a data center operations expert. Why don't we start at sort of 1,000-foot level? If you think about the global community of investors thinking about where to allocate their capital for the digital infrastructure opportunity, what do they need to understand about what the market looks like in Europe right now?
So the one thing I would say about Europe is that it is not one location. Each country still has a lot of autonomy and a lot of specific regulation and legislation and ways of working, not to mention culture and language. And probably the biggest difference to the North American market is that it is a collection of many, many unique markets with some areas of commonality. So that's probably the 1,000-foot view.
Can you talk about your analysis of demand across Europe and what it suggests about the demand to build data centers and how that informs your own strategy?
Europe has enjoyed a strong double-digit demand, particularly for data centers to underpin the adoption of cloud. The sort of 12 to 18% compound annual growth, steady growth, as I would call it, for continued cloud adoption post-COVID. For anyone that doesn't know, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin are the sort of tier one, the primary markets in Europe. All of those, for different reasons, are constrained at the moment. And thus there's been the emergence of a whole sort of secondary market set of locations, for example, Berlin in Germany, Madrid, Manchester in the UK, albeit the UK is obviously not part of the European Union anymore. And it's, again, underpinned by still quite a broad range of sort of digital adoption, right? Digital services, government, e-government services, medium and large enterprises moving, more and more services to public cloud. And that adoption varies quite significantly. So, for example, cloud adoption, public cloud adoption in Germany is still quite low in comparison to other Western European countries and certainly in comparison to the US.
You mentioned that there are different reasons for constraints across the European tier one markets. Is there a common theme? Is it energy? Is it regulatory?
It's both of the above, really. I would say in Europe, the energy constraint is less about the aggregate demand and supply ratio. It's more about the ability to get the energy from where it is being generated to where it needs to be used, or if you put it a different way, to where the sort of hubs of those data centers are today. So if you look, for example, at Frankfurt, more in the southern part of Germany, the predominance of generation, particularly the newer renewable generation, is in the northern part of Germany. I think Frankfurt would, if it could, continue to grow unconstrained, at least from a power perspective. The emergence of Berlin is predominantly a way of getting access to the power. The regulatory side is it's less, I think, regulatory, more about how data centers are obviously now very much more in the public eye. People are aware of them. No matter how pretty you make a data center look, with green facades and unique architectural designs, they're still not particularly compatible, at least visually, with residential areas. Tier one markets have grown up historically in the outskirts of cities and metros that have obviously expanded. And so those data centers now find themselves bumping up very much against residential developments. It's still difficult politically to develop in those primary markets. And part of going to the second tier markets and even the third tier markets is to get into areas where obviously as data centers get larger and larger and even turn into campuses of multiple large buildings, you're further away from upsetting residentials.
You mentioned the UK and Brexit. To what extent does the UK's status outside of the European Union affect the data center investment opportunity in the UK?
There are, I would say, puts and takes. There have been benefits gained, certainly, but there have been opportunities lost. Clearly, you can no longer serve the European market from a data sovereignty perspective from the UK. But then if you want to serve the UK market, clearly you have to be in the UK market, and Dublin doesn't work. You literally need to be in the UK. Given the UK status, certainly from an international business perspective, from a financial hub perspective, this is still a significant opportunity and arguably one of the easier locations to develop, particularly if you're coming from the US, with a lot of the financial services still headquartered in London. It's still a very viable market, sort of standing on its own outside Europe. But indeed, the opportunity again to serve the broader European from the UK market has obviously gone post-Brexit.
Let's talk a bit more about DTCP's sustainable strategy within digital infrastructure. You invest in data centers, fiber networks, wireless towers. Perhaps we could look at a recent case study. What is important for us to understand about DTCP's investment in Greenscale?
Greenscale was really conceived through a couple of different aspects. One was indeed sustainability, and the other was the trend towards ever larger developments, ever larger single building developments, as well as campuses, and the need, therefore, to not just be a consumer of energy, another grid customer, but actually work with the grid providers and grid operators in a much more mutually beneficial way. The vast majority of European grids have a significant commitment from a decarbonisation perspective, which predominantly means wind and solar for most of the European states. With that comes the close association of grid-level battery energy storage and the desire for stable baseloads, which the larger data center developments actually now can represent, almost replacing the steel and aluminum mills that were the sort of stable base loads of the past. The larger data center campus developments, 100 megawatt plus, 200 megawatt plus and beyond, represent an opportunity to work with the grid providers, work with the renewable investors and developers, and really put together a cohesive proposition, story, investment thesis around the development of, for example, a campus with long-term access to renewable generation, which provides long-term energy security for the data center operator and its customers, and really assists with the grid decarbonisation efforts, which are high on the political agenda, as I said, in most of the Western European countries. And that is really the thesis behind Greenscale, is to seek and source and develop those long-term locations where you can have multiple buildings, many multiple hundreds of megawatts, and develop that in an integrated way with the energy side of the equation.
What would you say are the skills, experience resident at DTCP that makes this Greenscale investments right in your wheelhouse?
It's our knowledge, experience, and track record in Europe specifically, particularly within the EU. So DTCP is, as you know, a German headquartered business. We do have offices in the UK and London as well, but we're extremely well connected throughout the continental Europe, the whole supply chain. And I'm using supply chain in the broadest set of terms. We have very deep relationships with the banks here in Europe and what they need in terms of being able to get comfort around financing such projects. We have deep relationships with the early stage developers of land and power. We know how to deal culturally and politically with municipalities, with local governments, with central governments for zoning. Getting land zoned and permitted in Europe is a really complex, and it can be quite a minefield for those that, are not familiar. And it can be quite different getting through zoning and permitting approval in Germany versus France, versus Spain, versus Italy. They may as well be in the four corners of the earth. It's our deep knowledge an experience of having developed pretty much in all the Western European countries, some of the Eastern European countries in the past as well, and up into the Nordics. That gives us our advantage and why we focused heavily on Europe.
You invest not only in data centers, but in wireless towers and fiber networks. What can you tell us about the network of fiber across Europe and the degree of investment that is required to get it to a more optimized state?
All of our sort of large centers of GDP are relatively close to each other, right? We don't have the sort of West Coast, East Coast, and large expanse of land in the middle that you have in the US. We're relatively dense and relatively well spread. If you look at it more from a macro perspective and what investment is needed, I think as the data center hubs move beyond just those FLAP-D markets and into the tier 2 and potentially tier 3 markets, you can easily start to imagine the need for a lot more B2B fiber and then services built on top of the optical networks for really the emergence of the AI application side of things, which is AI inference, which we're still at the infancy of. Obviously, lots of people building large data centers to train large language models at the moment, but inference is accepted as going to become the larger consumer of both data center capacity and network capacity. Difficult to say at the moment where and what type of investment will be needed between which metros. You can start to put some pins in the map, sort of obvious tier 2 locations. Lisbon would be one of them. Barcelona would be another one of those. Brussels, certainly Berlin, as I've mentioned before. So I think you'll start to see those locations driving demand for investment.
Zahl, you're an operations expert for data centers. What have been some of the most impressive gains that have been made within data centers as far as efficiency and operations, and where did those gains come from?
No disrespect to anyone out there that spent a lot of time and effort and potentially money in R&D. Data centers have come historically from a world where no one knew what they were, where they were. They were relatively small, and the word efficiency and the term PUE didn't exist, right? So there really wasn't any focus. The only focus data centers had at that point in time was availability, right? It needs to stay available 24/7. It needs to be able to cope with failures of individual pieces of equipment. Certainly at the beginning, there were some relatively big gains and improvements made through, quite honestly, some fairly simple initiatives in existing data centers. And then, a relatively small series of changes. I can hear some of my supply chain colleagues saying, well, it wasn't that simple. For example, it used to be the case that every piece of sort of rotating machinery on the cooling side in data centers was fixed speed, so irrespective of the load in the data center, the fans were all rotating at the same speed, the chiller motors were all rotating at the same speed, and there was a lot of waste. The biggest improvement by far has been paying more attention to the way the buildings are controlled. So the building control systems, having energy management systems, retrofitting or designing new data centers with variable frequency drives or with plug EC fans, a whole series of different innovations. Many of them have been borrowed from other sectors and implemented within the data center sector. The combination of all of that and having an energy management system in place and having energy efficiency as really the second most important thing behind availability. The regulation in Europe means, you can't really build a data center with a design PUE north of 1.2. I think the industry's done a great job of getting itself to a much more informed and much more efficient position overall.
What are the key themes that you're looking for right now? What does your pipeline look like? When you meet someone or you reconnect with someone in the market, what do you tell them you're looking for?
We describe ourselves really as company builders. We are looking for businesses that are established but have not yet scaled. We're looking for businesses led by a management team, at least a core management team that has a strong track record, that have the relationships with the necessary off-takers of capacity. We do not build data centers on a speculative basis. So it is about matching the acquisition of the right powered land. And in some cases, we will get involved in sort of the latter stages of the development of powered land and work bilaterally with individuals who may have already spent, 2, 3, 4, 5 years even working with landowners and municipalities and going through zoning approvals, engaging with utility companies. And we're geared up to be able to come in at those latter stages. We're all about helping the businesses that have established at least some traction, and then bringing our expertise, our capital, both from an equity and a debt perspective, to the table to help really scale those businesses. And I think Maincubes is a wonderful example of that. When we acquired them, they had 15 megawatts in total across 2 sites, and 2.5 years later, they're now at 270 megawatts. So it's a perfect example of the type of business that we like to get involved with, and at stage we like to get involved with, and what we can achieve together with the management team.
Excellent. Well, Zahl Limbuwala from DTCP, thank you so much for speaking to Cool Vector today, and I hope we can have you back to help us understand what's going on in the European digital infrastructure market.
Thanks very much, David.